This video is on the functions of judge and jury as governed by Rule 104A and 104B on pages 406 to 411 of your textbook. The question that we'll be looking at is who gets to decide whether the requirements of an evidence rule have been met. Is it the judge or the jury? Not surprisingly, it's usually the judge who gets to decide whether the evidence is admissible, or put differently, whether the requirements of the relevant evidence rule have been met. In doing so, the judge uses the preponderance of the evidence standard to determine whether the rule has been met. In making this decision, the rule specifies that the judge may consider any evidence, including evidence that is not necessarily admissible at trial. In a few situations, however, the jury gets to decide whether the evidence is admissible in the sense that it meets the requirements of the governing rule. The judge still plays a role, however, when 104B applies. The judge plays a screening role here, making sure that a reasonable jury could find by a preponderance that the rule has been met. Okay, so in this situation, the judge himself is not deciding by a preponderance whether the rule's requirements have been met, but rather is saying, regardless of what I think, could a reasonable jury find by a preponderance that the evidence rule has been met? Rule 104B comes up fairly rarely. In other words, it is unusual for the jury to be the decider and for the judge to play this more limited screening role. For purposes of our class, I will expect you to know that the jury has the ultimate call on this in four situations with respect to Rule 404B, character evidence, Rule 412, the rape shield rule, Rule 602, requiring that a witness has personal knowledge, and Rule 901, which governs authentication of evidence. We'll be spending most of our time focusing on this with regard to Rule 404B, but we're going to hold that until we reach 404B in the course materials. Okay, so just to be sure that you understand the different role that the judge plays depending on whether Rule 104A applies, so that the judge himself decides whether the evidence is admissible, or 104B applies, so the judge plays a screening role. Let's look at it. Under Rule 104A, where the judge decides, how certain does the judge have to be that each one of the rule's requirements have been met? The judge has to be at a preponderance. In other words, he has to be more than 50% certain that the rule's requirements have been met. Now, let's look at 104B, where the judge is simply playing a screening role. Under Rule 104B, how certain does the judge have to be? Well, we know that the judge himself doesn't have to get to the preponderance standard. The judge is simply asking, could a reasonable jury find by a preponderance that the evidence rule's requirements have been met? So that's going to mean that the judge need only get to something short of 50%. It's not clear what point exactly the judge has to get to, but the judge only has to be able to say, regardless of whether I think it gets there, could a reasonable person think so? And that's a much lower standard. Okay, so now please take the short quiz on TWEN to be sure you've got this, and thank you for watching.